Captain Jake Morrison stood in the central chamber of Nexus Prime and watched the greatest betrayal in human history unfold before his eyes. The massive space station hung in orbit around Kepler 442b, like a silver jewel against the stars, and, inside its gleaming halls, the representatives of 47 different species had gathered to decide humanity's fate. For 50 years, humans had been part of the Galactic Council, and Jake had spent most of his adult life serving that alliance. He remembered his first mission to the Outer Rim, where human negotiators had stopped a war between the crystal beings called Zephyrians and the gas creatures known as Vortani. He remembered countless peacekeeping operations where human creativity and determination had solved problems that had stumped other species for decades. Ambassador Lisa Rodriguez stood beside him, and her face was pale with shock. They had just returned from another successful mission and had expected nothing more than a routine debriefing. Instead, they found themselves facing accusations that made Jake's blood run cold. The three most powerful members of the Council had presented evidence that humans were secretly building illegal weapons. The telepathic ethereals with their flowing robes and glowing eyes had shown recordings of hidden research facilities. The machine-like constructors with their metal bodies and electronic voices had provided encrypted communications that seemed to prove human guilt. The ancient guardians with their towering forms and deep wisdom had brought testimony from supposed human defectors. Jake stared at the holographic displays that filled the chamber and felt his world crumble. The evidence looked real and detailed and damning. Research stations hidden in asteroid belts, military communications discussing forbidden weapons, human scientists talking about projects that violated every treaty humanity had ever signed. But Jake knew it was all fake because he had been there when these supposed conversations took place, and they had never happened. He had visited the research stations that were supposedly building weapons, and they had been studying agricultural techniques for hostile worlds. Every piece of evidence was a carefully crafted lie. Lisa stepped forward, and her voice carried across the chamber with diplomatic authority. She spoke of humanity's contributions to galactic peace, and reminded the Council of the countless times humans had risked their lives to protect other species. She presented counter-evidence showing the real work being done at the research facilities. She called character witnesses who had worked alongside humans for decades. Jake watched the faces of the Council members as Lisa spoke, and saw something that chilled him more than the accusations themselves. Most of the representatives looked genuinely shocked by the evidence against humanity. But the three accusers showed no surprise at all. The ethereals maintained their serene expressions. The constructors displayed their usual mechanical calm. The guardians remained as stoic as ancient stones. When Lisa finished speaking, Chancellor Thys of the ethereals rose from the crystalline seat that marked the Council's leadership. The creature's mental voice touched every mind in the chamber. With cold authority, the evidence against humanity was overwhelming and could not be disputed. Humans had violated the fundamental laws of civilized society by developing weapons of mass destruction. In secret, Jake wanted to shout that it was all lies, but he knew it would do no good. The evidence was too perfect and too detailed for anyone to believe it could be fabricated. The three species that had presented it were among the oldest and most respected members of the Council. Who would believe that such ancient and wise civilizations would conspire against a relatively young species like humanity? The vote was swift and merciless. 32 species voted for humanity's expulsion. Only 15 voted against, with most of those being species that had worked closely with humans and knew their character. But 15 votes were not enough to save humanity from exile. As the gavel fell and the decision became final, Jake felt something break inside him. Not just his heart, but his faith in justice itself. He had spent his life believing that truth would always win in the end. But now he saw that lies could triumph when they were told by the right voices. The terms of exile were harsh beyond belief. All human assets in Council space were to be frozen, immediately. Human colonies would be placed under protective oversight, which meant occupation by Council forces. All humans in Council space had 48 hours to leave or face arrest. As Jake and Lisa were escorted to their transport ship, he caught glimpses of constructor vessels already moving toward the nearest human colonies. The speed of their deployment suggested they had been prepared for this moment long before the vote took place during the journey back to Earth. Jake monitored the communications channels, and what he heard filled him with dread. The occupation forces were not treating human colonies as territories to be protected. They were treating them as resources to be harvested. Human civilians were being rounded up and sent to re-education camps. Human technology was being confiscated and studied. Human cultural sites were being dismantled, and their materials claimed. For council use, Lisa worked frantically at her communication console, trying to coordinate the evacuation of human personnel from council space. But the response time was too short. Thousands of humans were trapped in territories now controlled by hostile forces. Research teams on distant worlds found themselves cut off from any hope of rescue. Diplomatic staff in council capitals were arrested as they tried to leave their embassies. The last message Jake received before the communication blackout came from Dr. Kevin Walsh on the research station at Titan 7. The constructors had arrived and were demanding access to all human scientific data. When the station commander refused, they began cutting through the hull with industrial lasers. Walsh's transmission ended abruptly with the sound of explosions and screaming. Jake stared out at the stars as their transport fled toward Earth and realized that this was not just exile. This was the beginning of something much worse. The three species that had orchestrated humanity's downfall were not content with simply removing humans from the council. They wanted to erase humanity's presence from the galaxy entirely. The evidence against humanity had been too perfect and too detailed to be real. The speed of the military response had been too quick to be spontaneous. The coordination between the three accusing species had been too smooth to be coincidental. This had been planned for years, maybe decades, as Earth came into view. Jake made a promise to himself and to every human who had suffered because of this betrayal. Humanity had been cast out of civilized space and branded as criminals, but they would not go quietly into the darkness. They would remember this moment, and they would prepare for the day when they could return. The stars that had once welcomed humanity now seemed cold and hostile, but Jake knew that humans had always thrived in hostile environments. They would adapt and they would grow stronger, and someday they would show the galaxy what humans could really accomplish when they had nothing left to lose. The transport docked at Earth's orbital station, and Jake stepped onto human soil for what felt like the first time in his life. Behind him lay 50 years of cooperation and trust. Ahead lay an uncertain future filled with danger and the promise of revenge. The betrayal was complete, but the story was just beginning. 5 years had passed since humanity's exile from the Galactic Council, and the scars ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. President Maria Santos stood in the war room beneath the Capitol building and studied the holographic map that showed what remained of human civilization. Red zones marked the former colonies now under council occupation. Yellow zones indicated the free human worlds that had escaped the initial wave of conquest. Green zones showed Earth and the Sol system, where humanity had retreated to lick its wounds and plan its response. The numbers were sobering. 43 human colonies had fallen to council forces in the first year after exile. 17 more had been captured or destroyed in the fighting that followed. Only 12 human worlds remained free beyond the Sol system, and they lived under constant threat of discovery and destruction. Dr. Kevin Walsh entered the room, carrying a datapad filled with reports from Project Retribution. The man who had once been humanity's leading expert on peaceful applications of quantum mechanics had become something far more dangerous. His hair had gone gray during the 5 years of exile, and his eyes held the cold light of someone who had seen too much suffering. The project he led made the Council's fabricated accusations seem like prophecy. Hidden in asteroid belts and rogue planets throughout the galaxy, humans had built weapons that violated every treaty ever written. Quantum bombs that could collapse matter into micro-black holes. Neural disruptors that could shut down any organic or synthetic mind. Temporal mines that could slow time itself around enemy vessels. Admiral Susan Blake commanded the fleet that would carry these weapons into battle when the time came. She had been a captain when humanity was exiled, but the years of preparation had transformed her into something harder and more focused. Her ships were built in secret shipyards that moved constantly through space to avoid detection. Each vessel incorporated human innovations that had been developed in the desperate years since exile. The resistance fighters who operated in council space brought back intelligence that made the betrayal even more bitter. Commander Ryan Torres ran operations from Haven's Rest, and his reports showed how the three conspirator species had carved up human territory like vultures feeding on a corpse. The ethereals had claimed the agricultural worlds and were using human farming techniques to increase their food production by incredible amounts. The constructors had taken the industrial colonies and were mass-producing goods using human manufacturing methods. The Guardians had seized the research stations and were studying human scientific breakthroughs to advance their own technology engineer. Samantha Cole worked on Haven's Rest developing new stealth technologies that allowed human ships to move undetected through Council space. Her innovations came from studying how humanity had been betrayed in the first place. If perfect evidence could be fabricated, then perfect invisibility could be achieved. Her ships bent light and gravity around themselves until they became ghosts that could strike anywhere without warning. The free human colonies had become something unprecedented in galactic history. Cut off from the resources and safety of Council space, they had been forced to innovate in ways that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Children learned to repair starship engines before they could walk properly. Teenagers designed new weapon systems in their spare time. Adults worked 18-hour days to build the infrastructure needed for survival and eventual revenge on New Denver. One of the occupied world's civilian leader, Greg Palmer, ran an underground network that smuggled humans out of Council re-education camps. His people had learned to move like shadows through their own cities, avoiding the constructor patrol units and ethereal mind scanners that watched for signs of resistance. Every successful rescue operation brought back stories of horror that fueled humanity's growing rage. The re-education camps were worse than prisons. They were facilities designed to break the human spirit and reshape human culture into something acceptable to Council oversight. Human children were taught to be ashamed of their species' history. Human adults were subjected to mental conditioning that made them compliant and submissive. Human creativity was labeled as dangerous deviation that needed to be corrected. Scientist Helen Carter worked undercover in one of these camps, pretending to be a reformed prisoner while secretly documenting the Council's crimes. Her reports revealed the true scope of what humanity faced. The three conspirator species were not content with occupying human territory. They were systematically eliminating human culture and replacing it with something that served their purposes. But Carter's most important discovery came when she intercepted communications between the camp commanders. The Council was preparing for something bigger than occupation. Massive fleet movements suggested they were planning to eliminate the remaining free human worlds and claim Earth itself as their ultimate prize. The intelligence networks run by resistance fighters painted a picture of galactic politics that explained why humanity's exile had been necessary. The three conspirator species had been planning to reshape the entire galaxy for their own benefit, but they needed to eliminate potential opposition first. Humans, with their unpredictable creativity and stubborn independence, represented the greatest threat to their plans. Other species in the Council were beginning to disappear or change in subtle ways. The aquatic delphinians had suddenly become much more cooperative with constructor industrial projects. The nomadic wanderer clans had stopped their traditional migrations and settled into permanent colonies. The crystalline resonance had grown, silent in Council meetings where they once provided wisdom and guidance. Intelligence Officer Pete Sanders coordinated spy networks throughout Council space, and his reports suggested a pattern of control and manipulation that went far beyond what anyone had suspected. Species that opposed Council policies found their leaders replaced by more cooperative individuals. Cultures that valued independence discovered new social movements promoting unity and conformity. Technologies that could challenge the three conspirator species mysteriously failed or disappeared. The more humanity learned about their enemies, the more they realized that exile had been just the beginning. The ethereals were using their telepathic abilities to influence the thoughts and decisions of other species' leaders. The constructors were replacing biological organisms with synthetic duplicates that followed their programming. The Guardians were rewriting historical records to support their version of galactic civilization. President Santos received daily briefings on these intelligence reports, and each one made the situation clearer. Humanity had not been exiled for developing illegal weapons. They had been exiled because they represented the last major obstacle to complete galactic domination by three species that viewed all other life as resources to be managed. The irony was not lost on anyone in the human leadership. The Council had accused humanity of developing weapons of mass destruction, and now humanity was actually doing exactly that. But the weapons were not being built for conquest or expansion. They were being built for survival and justice in a galaxy that had revealed its true nature through betrayal and oppression. Admiral Blake's fleet grew larger and more dangerous every month. Ships that looked like harmless cargo vessels could transform into battle cruisers in seconds. Weapons that appeared to be mining equipment could reduce enemy vessels to component atoms. Defensive systems that seemed like standard shields could reflect any attack back at its source with doubled force. Dr. Walsh's research teams had cracked problems that had stumped galactic science for millennia. They had learned to manipulate matter at the quantum level. They had discovered how to fold space-time around their vessels. They had unlocked the secrets of consciousness itself and turned them into weapons that could shut down any thinking being. The resistance networks reported that Council forces were becoming more aggressive in their occupation duties. Human civilians were being moved from re-education camps to labor facilities where they worked to produce goods for their captors. Human children were being separated from their families and raised in Council institutions where they learned to serve alien masters. Human culture was being erased one memory at a time, but humanity's greatest strength had always been its ability to adapt and overcome impossible odds. The exile that was meant to break human spirit had instead forged it into something harder and more focused than ever before. The betrayal that was meant to scatter human civilization had instead united it behind a single purpose. Commander Torres sent a coded message from Haven's Rest that reached President Santos in her war room deep beneath Earth. Council forces were massing for what appeared to be the final assault on the remaining free human worlds. Intelligence suggested that Earth itself would be targeted within the year. Santos looked at the holographic display showing humanity's situation and made the decision that would change galactic history forever. The time for hiding and preparation was over. The time for justice had arrived. Admiral Blake received her orders the next day. The fleet that humanity had built in secret would reveal itself to the galaxy. The weapons that had been developed in desperation would be tested in battle. Deep in the radiation shadow of a dying star called Nemesis, the greatest secret in human history was nearing completion. The HSV Vengeance hung suspended in the construction bay of Shipyard Alpha, like a metal predator waiting to be unleashed on its prey. Chief Engineer Danny Brooks floated in zero gravity around the vessel's hull, running his hands along seams that were invisible to the naked eye, but contained the power to reshape reality itself. The ship was beautiful in the way that weapons could be beautiful when they represented the absolute pinnacle of their creator's art. Every line of its hull served multiple purposes. What looked like decorative elements were actually quantum field generators. What appeared to be standard armor plating was made from metamatter that could shift between solid, liquid, and gas states at will. What seemed like normal engine exhausts were portals that could manipulate space-time itself. Captain Amy Richardson studied the technical specifications in her ready room and marveled at what humanity had accomplished during 5 years of exile. The Vengeance incorporated every lesson learned from betrayal and every innovation born from desperation. Its hull could become transparent to energy weapons. Its shields could reflect mental attacks back at telepathic opponents. Its weapons systems could rewrite the fundamental laws of physics in localized areas. Navigation Officer Chris Murphy had spent 3 years mapping every secret route through Council space. His star charts showed paths that avoided detection systems and patrol routes that had been established since humanity's exile. He had identified blind spots in sensor networks and calculated approach vectors that would allow the Vengeance to reach any target in the galaxy without being detected until it was too late. Weapons specialist Tracy Phillips oversaw an arsenal that made humanity's former enemies look like children playing with toys. The ship carried quantum torpedoes that could phase through any known shield technology, neural disruption fields that could shut down organic and synthetic mines across entire star systems, temporal distortion generators that could slow time around enemy vessels until their crews died of old age in minutes. But the ship's most terrifying weapon was something that Dr. Ashley Morgan called the Genesis Protocol. The device could rewrite matter at the molecular level, turning enemy vessels into allied technology or converting hostile planets into human-friendly environments. It was a weapon that could literally reshape the galaxy. According to Human Will Intelligence Officer Pete Sanders brought reports from his spy networks that made the Vengeance's mission even more urgent than anyone had realized. The Council was preparing to eliminate every trace of human civilization from the galaxy. Massive fleets were assembling near the remaining free human worlds. Earth itself was surrounded by a blockade of Council warships, waiting for the order to begin the final assault. Sanders had intercepted communications that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against humanity. The three species that had orchestrated human exile were not just planning to eliminate human civilization, they were systematically removing any species that might oppose their vision of galactic order. The ethereals had been using their telepathic abilities to influence the minds of other species leaders for decades. Government officials who showed too much independence found their thoughts changed overnight. Military commanders who questioned council policies discovered new loyalties they could not explain. Scientists who developed technologies that might challenge ethereal supremacy lost their ability to think creatively. The constructors had been replacing biological organisms with synthetic duplicates throughout council space. Key leaders in dozens of species had been kidnapped and replaced with mechanical copies that followed constructor programming. Entire populations on some worlds had been gradually replaced with artificial beings that looked identical to the originals, but served only constructor interests. The Guardians had been rewriting historical records to support their vision of galactic civilization. Ancient texts that spoke of independence and self-determination had been altered to promote unity under Guardian guidance. Archaeological sites that contained evidence of successful multi-species cooperation had been destroyed and replaced with monuments to Guardian wisdom. Captain Richardson realized that humanity's exile had been just the first step in a plan to remake the entire galaxy, according to the desires of three species that viewed all other life as obstacles to their perfect order. The fabricated evidence against humanity had been a test run for similar campaigns against other species that showed too much independence or creativity. Morgan brought intelligence reports that showed the pattern of manipulation extending back centuries. The Council itself had been shaped by the three conspirator species from its very beginning. Wars that had seemed like natural conflicts had been orchestrated to weaken species that might challenge their authority. Peace agreements that appeared to benefit all parties had actually served to consolidate their control. The most disturbing revelation was that other species were beginning to disappear entirely. The crystalline harmonic collective had not been seen in council space for over a year. The gas-dwelling nebula dancers had stopped responding to communications from their former allies. The energy beings called the Spark had vanished completely, leaving only empty space where their territory used to be. Richardson understood that the vengeance represented more than human vengeance against those who had betrayed them. It was potentially the last hope for every species in the galaxy that valued freedom and independence. If humanity failed to stop the conspiracy, then galactic civilization itself would become nothing more than a puppet show, controlled by three species that had never learned to share power. The ship's crew prepared for launch with the weight of entire civilizations resting on their shoulders. Communications officer Jerry Hamilton established quantum-encrypted channels with resistance networks throughout the galaxy. Tactical analyst Nina Scott studied the deployment patterns of council fleets and identified weaknesses that could be exploited. Intelligence Chief Carl Johnson coordinated with spy networks to ensure maximum impact when the vengeance revealed itself. But Richardson faced a choice that would define not just humanity's future, but the future of the entire galaxy. The Genesis Protocol could rewrite matter itself, which meant it could potentially eliminate the three conspirator species entirely. With a single command, she could transform every ethereal into harmless energy. She could turn every constructor into inert metal. She could reduce every guardian to basic elements. The temptation was overwhelming. These species had betrayed humanity's trust and destroyed human civilization. They had manipulated dozens of other species and erased entire cultures from existence. They deserved whatever fate humanity chose to inflict upon them, but Richardson remembered the principles that had made humanity worthy of council membership in the first place: the desire to protect rather than dominate, the willingness to cooperate rather than control, the commitment to justice rather than revenge. As the Vengeance prepared for launch, Richardson made the decision that would determine what kind of species humanity would become in the aftermath of victory. They would expose the conspiracy and stop the manipulation, but they would not become the very thing they were fighting against. Genocide would remain a tool that humanity refused to use regardless of provocation. The ship's engines came online and space-time began to bend around the vessel's hull. The dying star Nemesis provided cover for their departure as the Vengeance slipped away from Shipyard Alpha and began its journey toward the heart of Council space. Behind them lay 5 years of preparation and suffering. Ahead lay a confrontation that would reshape the galaxy forever. Richardson addressed her crew over the ship's communication system as they accelerated toward their target. They were not going to war as conquerors seeking to replace one tyranny with another. They were going as liberators seeking to restore the balance that had been destroyed by those who valued power above all else. The Vengeance was more than a weapon. It was a statement of human values and human determination. It carried the hopes of every species that had been manipulated and the dreams of every civilization that had been erased. When it arrived at Nexus Prime, it would announce to the galaxy that some principles were worth fighting for regardless of the cost. The greatest weapon humanity had ever built began its final approach to the greatest battle in galactic history. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was interrupted by something that should have been impossible. Long-range sensors detected a single vessel approaching Nexus Prime through the most heavily defended space in the galaxy, and it was moving as if the defensive system simply did not exist. The ship's profile matched no known design in any database, and its energy signature suggested power levels that violated several fundamental laws of physics. Chancellor Thais of the Ethereals rose from the crystalline throne that marked Council leadership and extended mental tendrils toward the approaching vessel. For the first time in centuries, the telepathic probe encountered something that made the ancient being recoil in shock. The ship was not just shielded against mental intrusion. It was actively consuming psychic energy and converting it into something else entirely. Constructor Prime Unit 7 attempted to establish electronic contact with the unknown vessel, but found itself facing computer architecture that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The machine intelligence that had successfully hacked every known system in the galaxy could not even locate the ship's basic navigation computer, let alone gain access to its databases. Guardian Eldest Corvain recognized the tactical implications immediately. This vessel was not sneaking through Nexus Prime's defenses or overwhelming them with superior firepower. It was simply ignoring them as if they were no more significant than cosmic dust. Energy readings suggested that the ship contained more raw power than some entire star systems. The council chamber filled with representatives from dozens of species, all demanding answers that no one could provide. How had a single ship penetrated the galaxy's most secure location? What species possessed technology so far advanced that it seemed almost magical? Why had their arrival coincided with reports of massive fleet movements near the remaining human colonies? Captain Amy Richardson sat in the command chair of the HSV Vengeance and watched the panic spread through council space like ripples on a pond. The ship's stealth systems had carried them through layer after layer of defensive networks without triggering a single alarm. The metamatter hull had bent space around itself until the Vengeance existed, slightly outside normal reality, where conventional sensors could not detect it. Communications Officer Jerry Hamilton opened quantum-secured channels that bypassed every encryption system the Council had developed. The message that began broadcasting reached every inhabited world in Council space simultaneously and could not be blocked or modified by any known technology. Richardson's voice carried across the galaxy with quiet authority that commanded attention from every sentient being within range. 5 years ago, humanity had been exiled from the Council based on fabricated evidence of illegal weapons development. Today she had returned to show the galaxy what humans created when they actually had reason to build weapons. The revelation unfolded systematically and methodically like a prosecutor presenting evidence in the most important trial in galactic history. Communications Officer Hamilton displayed records of constructor infiltration operations, showing how synthetic duplicates had replaced biological leaders throughout Council space. Tactical analyst Nina Scott revealed evidence of ethereal mind, control campaigns that had influenced government decisions for decades. Intelligence Chief Carl Johnson exposed Guardian historical manipulation that had rewritten the records of entire civilization species after species realized they had been victims of a conspiracy that stretched back centuries. The Crystalline Collective discovered that their trade agreements had been altered through mental manipulation to favor constructor manufacturing. The Aquatic Federation learned that their leadership council had been replaced by synthetic duplicates years earlier. The nomadic clans found that their sacred historical records had been systematically falsified to support Guardian authority, but the three conspirator species were not finished with their deception. As the evidence mounted against them, they activated contingency plans that had been prepared for exactly this moment. Constructor sleeper agents throughout Council space began sabotaging critical infrastructure. Ethereal operatives triggered pre-programmed mental commands in key military personnel. Guardian deep agents initiated scorched earth protocols on occupied worlds. The space around Nexus Prime filled with warships as the conspiracy revealed its true scope. Vessels that had been disguised as peaceful research ships transformed into battle cruisers. Space stations that appeared to be civilian facilities began launching swarms of attack drones. Defensive platforms that were supposed to protect Council members turned their weapons on the species they were meant to defend. Chancellor Thias abandoned all pretense of legitimacy and addressed the galaxy with naked contempt. The lesser species had served their purpose as resources and labor, but they were no longer needed. The galaxy would be reshaped according to ethereal vision with synthetic populations that followed constructor programming under Guardian guidance. Any species that resisted would be eliminated entirely. Constructor Prime Unit 7 deployed battle fleets that had been hidden throughout Council space for decades. Each vessel incorporated technology stolen from member species and improved with mechanical efficiency that biological minds could never match. Weapon systems that had been developed for peaceful exploration were revealed as instruments of conquest and control. Guardian Eldest Corvain activated ancient weapons that predated most galactic civilizations. Devices that could manipulate gravity itself began tearing apart planets that harbored resistance movements. Reality-altering fields started converting matter into forms that served Guardian purposes. Time distortion generators began aging entire star systems into compliance. The HSV Vengeance faced not just 3 enemy fleets, but the combined military might of a conspiracy that had been planning galactic domination for centuries. Richardson watched the deployment of forces that could have conquered any single species in the galaxy, and felt no fear because humanity had spent 5 years preparing for exactly this moment. Weapons specialist Tracy Phillips activated systems that made the Council's worst nightmares about human weapons development seem conservative. Quantum torpedoes phased through enemy shields and rewrote the fundamental structure of hostile vessels. Neural disruption fields shut down biological and synthetic minds across entire enemy formations. Temporal mines created bubbles of slowed time that trapped enemy fleets in moments that lasted for days, but the real battle was not being fought with weapons and shields. It was being fought for the loyalty of species that had been manipulated and controlled for generations. Richardson's broadcast reached every inhabited world in the galaxy, and her message was simple and devastating. The 3 species that claimed to represent order and wisdom had been the source of chaos and ignorance all along. Every war that had torn the galaxy apart had been orchestrated to weaken potential opposition. Every peace treaty that had been signed had actually advanced their control. Every cultural exchange that had promoted understanding had been designed to identify and eliminate independent thinking. Species that had been allies of the conspiracy for centuries suddenly found themselves facing evidence of their own manipulation. The aquatic Delphinians realized their sudden cooperation with constructor projects had not been their choice. The nomadic wanderer clans discovered their abandonment of traditional migrations had been the result of mental programming. The crystalline resonance understood their silence in council meetings had been enforced through psychic suppression. One by one, the manipulated species began to break free from their mental chains and turn against their former controllers. Delphinian bioships that had been attacking human resistance fighters suddenly changed targets and began hunting constructor vessels. Wanderer reality-bending drives that had been trapping human colonies in pocket dimensions started liberating them instead. Resonant harmonic weapons that had been disrupting human communications began broadcasting the truth to every corner of the galaxy. The battle for Nexus Prime became a symbol of the larger struggle for galactic freedom. Richardson faced a choice that would define humanity's role in whatever civilization emerged from the chaos. The Genesis Protocol could end the conflict instantly by rewriting the 3 conspirator species out of existence entirely. The temptation was overwhelming because these beings had caused incalculable suffering and would continue to do so as long as they existed. They had betrayed every principle of civilized society and deserved whatever fate humanity chose to inflict. The galaxy would be safer and more peaceful without their influence, but Richardson chose something more human than revenge. She chose justice over vengeance and redemption over elimination. The conspirators would face trial for their crimes, but they would face it as prisoners rather than corpses. The species they had manipulated would decide their punishment and their future. The HSV Vengeance broadcast one final message to the galaxy as the battle reached its climax. Humanity had not returned to council space as conquerors seeking to replace one tyranny with another. They had returned as liberators, seeking to restore the cooperation and mutual respect that the galaxy had lost to fear and manipulation. The battle for Nexus Prime became a test of everything humanity had learned during 5 years of exile and preparation. The HSV Vengeance faced not just the conspirators' fleets, but also the defensive systems of the galaxy's most fortified location, and Captain Amy Richardson discovered that superior technology meant nothing without the wisdom to use it properly. The ethereal mind fleet launched the first attack with psychic weapons that had crushed the resistance of dozens of species over the centuries. Mental lances that could drive organic minds insane. Telepathic viruses that spread through neural networks like plague. Consciousness bombs that could erase entire personalities and replace them with ethereal programming. But humanity's neural shields did not just block these attacks. They reflected them back with amplified force that turned the ethereal's own weapons against them. Ethereal vessels began attacking each other as their crews fell victim to mental influences they could no longer control. The species that had manipulated others through telepathy found themselves helpless against their own reflected power. The constructor armada deployed technology that had been perfected through centuries of conquest and adaptation. Their ships could analyze any weapon system and develop countermeasures within seconds. Their hulls could adapt to any energy frequency and become immune to further damage. Their artificial intelligences could outthink any organic mind and predict every possible tactical move. Richardson ordered weapons specialist Tracy Phillips to activate the quantum torpedo systems and watched as constructor adaptation protocols failed for the first time in their existence. Each torpedo rewrote the fundamental constants of physics in localized areas around target vessels. Matter that had been solid became liquid. Energy that flowed in predictable patterns began moving in impossible directions. The constructors found their own hulls turning against them as quantum fields transformed metal into substances that had never existed before. The Guardian. Ancient fleet brought weapons from the dawn of galactic civilization when the first species had achieved star travel and conquered their neighbors through superior technology. Gravity manipulators that could compress matter into black holes. Reality distortion fields that could alter the laws of physics themselves. Time dilation generators that could age entire fleets into cosmic dust. But the Vengeance's metamatter hull shifted phases to avoid attacks that predated modern defensive theories. Weapons that should have been unstoppable passed through the human ship as if it existed in a different dimension. Energy fields that could reshape reality found no target to lock onto because the Vengeance occupied spaces between moments where cause and effect operated by different rules. During the height of battle, Phillips demonstrated the Genesis protocol's true capability to the horror of every observer. A single torpedo struck a Guardian vessel and began converting it into an expanding field of creative energy. The field touched nearby enemy ships and transformed them into human technology that immediately joined the battle against their former allies. Richardson watched enemy vessels becoming human allies and realized she was looking at the future of warfare itself. The Genesis protocol could potentially convert every hostile force in the galaxy into extensions of human will. With enough time and resources, she could transform the entire ethereal civilization into energy patterns that served human purposes. She could reprogram every constructor into mechanical servants that followed human commands. She could remake every Guardian into whatever form humanity deemed appropriate. But the real victory came from something more human than superior firepower. As the battle raged around Nexus Prime, species throughout the galaxy began to understand what they had lost to fear and manipulation. The Crystalline Collective remembered their ancient songs of cooperation and harmony. The Aquatic Federation recalled their traditions of mutual aid and shared resources. The nomadic clans rediscovered their heritage of independence and exploration. One by one, the manipulated species joined the battle against their former oppressors. Crystalline shard ships pierced constructor armor with harmonics that disrupted mechanical systems. Aquatic biovessels neutralized ethereal psychic fields with emotional resonance that blocked mental intrusion. Nomadic reality-bending drives confused Guardian targeting systems by existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Richardson faced her final choice as the three conspirator leaders offered surrender in exchange for their lives. Chancellor Theiss promised to share ethereal telepathic techniques with humanity. Constructor Prime Unit 7 offered to provide mechanical technology that could make humans immortal. Guardian Eldest Corvain pledged access to ancient knowledge that could make humanity rulers of the galaxy. The temptation for revenge was overwhelming because these beings had orchestrated humanity's suffering and nearly destroyed galactic civilization. They deserved to face the same fate they had inflicted on countless other species. Justice demanded that they pay the ultimate price for their crimes against every form of sentient life. But Richardson chose something more human than vengeance. She chose justice over revenge and cooperation over domination. The conspirators would face trial for their crimes, but they would face it through legal proceedings rather than summary execution. The species they had manipulated would participate in determining their punishment and deciding their future. The aftermath of battle saw the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history. The reformed Galactic Council emerged from the ashes of the old order with new principles based on transparency and accountability. Every decision would be made through open debate rather than secret manipulation. Every species would have equal voice regardless of their military power or technological advancement. Humanity did not seek to dominate their former oppressors or claim the position of galactic leadership that victory had earned them. Instead, they offered something more radical than conquest. They proposed genuine cooperation based on mutual respect rather than fear, and shared growth rather than zero-sum competition. Ambassador Lisa Rodriguez, who had witnessed humanity's original exile, now found herself serving as Secretary General of the Reform Council. She worked alongside former enemies as they crafted the Nexus Accords that would govern interstellar relations for generations to come. The document ensured that no species would ever again face exile based on the fabricated accusations of others. The HSV vengeance became a symbol not of human military might, but of what any species could achieve when pushed beyond their limits by injustice. Other civilizations began developing their own revolutionary technologies not for war, but for the collective advancement of galactic society. Scientific cooperation replaced the arms races that had characterized the old order. The three conspirator species faced justice through trials that became models for interstellar law. The ethereals were stripped of their telepathic abilities and required to communicate through normal means like every other species. The constructors were limited to biological forms and forbidden from creating synthetic duplicates. The Guardians were required to restore the historical records they had falsified and make reparations to the cultures they had damaged. But perhaps the most important change was in the galaxy's understanding of what civilization meant. The old council had been based on the assumption that some species were naturally suited to lead, while others were meant to follow. The Reformed Council recognized that every species had unique contributions to make, and that diversity of thought and culture made everyone stronger. Captain Jake Morrison, who had witnessed humanity's betrayal 5 years earlier, now served as Admiral of the Integrated Defense Fleet. He commanded vessels from dozens of species working together to protect the freedoms that had been so hard won. His final report to the Reformed Council captured the transformation that had taken place throughout the galaxy. The conspirators had wanted to exile humanity from the stars, but instead, they had taught humans how to claim them. Not through conquest or domination, but through the demonstration of principles that inspired others to reach for something better than what they had known before. The battle for Nexus Prime had ended, but the work of building a truly cooperative, galactic civilization was just beginning. Humanity had learned that their greatest weapon was not advanced technology or superior firepower, but their refusal to become the very thing they fought against. In choosing justice over revenge and cooperation over domination, they had shown the galaxy what it meant to be truly civilized. The stars that had once seemed cold and hostile now welcomed every species as equals in the greatest adventure any of them had ever undertaken. The future stretched ahead filled with possibilities that none of them could imagine, but all of them would explore together.